Evan Mercer had built his entire life on the assumption that he understood people. He read balance sheets the way other men read faces, with cold precision, without sentiment, without doubt. He had inherited his father's real estate empire at 28, doubled it by 32, and spent the years between learning that almost everything in the world could be reduced to a number: property values, market trends, risk assessments, people. That was why he was so certain, on the morning he slid the divorce papers across the kitchen island, that Alara Voss had nothing left to surprise him with. She stood at the counter with her back to him, pouring coffee she never drank when she was nervous. He noticed that. He noticed everything. It was one of his few genuine talents. But he had long since decided that noticing Alara's small habits was not worth the energy it cost him. She was quiet. She was careful. She was, in his father's words, a woman of no particular consequence who had attached herself to a consequential family without understanding what that truly meant. "The attorneys went over everything last night," Evan said, adjusting his cufflink. "You keep the apartment on 63rd through the end of the year. Quarterly allowance for 18 months. It's more than fair." Alara turned around. That was the thing he would think about later. Not what she said, not what she did, but the way she turned around, slowly, without the flinch he had been expecting. She looked at the papers on the counter for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and her face held an expression he had never once managed to decode in 3 years of marriage. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was something quieter and far more unnerving, the expression of a person who has already completed a calculation that the other person hasn't even started yet. She picked up the pen. She signed where the tabs indicated. Each signature was clean and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had made larger decisions with less ceremony. Then she removed her wedding ring. She set it beside the papers, not dropped it, not threw it, just placed it down with the same deliberate care she gave to everything, and she walked to the bedroom. She came back 12 minutes later with one suitcase. "Alara." He said her name because he felt, obscurely, that he should, that some version of decency required it. She stopped. She didn't turn around. "You were never meant for this world," he said. It was something he genuinely believed, and he said it with the gentleness of a man who considers himself merciful. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer at all. "I know," she finally said, and she left. Evan spent the rest of that day in back-to-back calls. The Midtown development, the Jersey waterfront acquisition, the quarterly earnings call his father insisted on handling personally, which meant an hour of listening to Wallace Mercer speak at length about strategic positioning while saying nothing of actual substance. The divorce did not occupy Evan's thoughts in any meaningful way. He had expected a period of mild administrative inconvenience. He had budgeted for it emotionally and financially and expected to be past it by Friday. He was not past it by Friday. He was not past it because on Friday morning at 6:47 a.m., his phone lit up with 17 simultaneous notifications, and when he walked to the window of his penthouse with his coffee still in hand, he saw something that made the cup stop halfway to his mouth. In the harbor below, gliding through the early mist with the unhurried authority of something that owned the water it moved through, was a yacht. Not a yacht in the way that Evan's clients owned yachts. The 200-foot leisure crafts with helicopter pads and Instagram-ready sun decks. This was something else entirely. Black hull, gold trim along the railings, built with the dimensions of a small warship and the aesthetic restraint of an entity that had nothing to prove to anyone. It flew no commercial flag. The private standard at its bow was one Evan didn't recognize, a dark emblem that meant nothing to him. And, he would soon discover, meant everything to half the financial underworld of the eastern seaboard. His phone rang. It was Marcus, his head of security, a former NYPD captain who had never once called Evan before 7 a.m. in 4 years of employment. "You watching the harbor?" Marcus said, without preamble. "I'm watching the harbor." "That's Cassian Vale's ship." Evan knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name the way you knew the name of a weather system. Not because you'd ever been close to one, but because the people who had were changed by the experience. Cassian Vale was 41 years old, born in Eastern Europe, educated in London, and had spent the last 15 years building a financial empire that existed in the uncomfortable space between the legitimate world and the one beneath it. He was not a man who appeared in newspapers willingly. He controlled shipping routes, private equity, 3 legitimate luxury hospitality brands, and according to federal task force reports that Marcus had no business having access to, but somehow did, the most sophisticated money movement operation the East Coast had seen since the 80s. "Why is he in my harbor?" Evan asked. "Not your harbor," Marcus said, "but I'd be asking that question too." By 7:15, there were armed men on the pier. Not conspicuous, they were dressed like private security, which technically they were, but armed in the way that told you these weren't men hired to look intimidating at a corporate event. They moved with economy. They watched everything. They created a perimeter around the gangway with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this in places where mistakes had real consequences. At 7:22, Cashin Vale walked off the yacht. Evan had seen photographs. Photographs had not prepared him. Vale was tall, not imposingly so, but with the particular posture of a man who had never once in his adult life been uncertain of his right to occupy space. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of tailoring that communicated wealth without performing it. His face was composed in the way that powerful men's faces were always composed in public. Not blank exactly, but resolved, the expression of someone who has already accounted for every variable in the room before entering it. He spoke to someone on the pier. Whatever he said was brief. Then he looked up. Not at the skyline, not at the city, but with the focused attention of a man looking for a specific thing. And then, clearly, loudly enough that Evan would later hear it from the building manager who had been standing near the pier entrance. "Where's my wife?" The words landed wrong. Evan turned them over twice before they settled, and even then they didn't make sense. Vale had no wife, or rather, if he had one, no record of her had ever surfaced in any profile Evan had read, and he had read several in the hours since Marcus first said the name. People like Cashin Vale kept their personal lives weaponized, meaning hidden, protected, deliberately absent from any documentation that could be used against them. The idea that Vale's wife might be somewhere in Manhattan was strange enough. The idea that was beginning to form at the edge of Evan's understanding, the idea he actively refused to complete for approximately 11 more minutes, was something else entirely. His phone buzzed. Marcus again. "She's in the lobby," Marcus said. "Who is?" A pause. "Elara." Evan moved to the elevator without thinking. He didn't put on shoes. He rode down 43 floors in his socks and stepped into the lobby of his own building just as the glass doors opened and Elara walked in from the street with her single suitcase. And behind her, 4 steps behind her, as though maintaining a respectful distance, was Cassian Vale. The lobby went still. The concierge, who had worked in this building for 11 years and prided himself on his composure, appeared to briefly forget what he was doing with his hands. Vale did not look at Evan immediately. He was looking at Elara with an expression that Evan could not immediately name because he had never seen that particular configuration on a man like that before. It was not possessiveness. It was not the performance of dominance. It was something that looked uncomfortably and undeniably like relief. Elara stopped walking when she saw Evan. There was a moment, not long, 3 or 4 seconds, where the three of them existed in the strange geometry of the lobby and nobody said anything. Then Vale stepped forward, took the handle of Elara's suitcase from her hand with a quietness that felt almost ceremonial, and turned to look at Evan for the first time. "Mr. Mercer," he said. His accent was faint, not gone, just worn smooth. "I apologize for the disruption." Evan stared at him, then at Elara. "What is this?" he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Elara looked at him, and there was that expression again, the one he had never been able to decode. Up close it was worse. It held no cruelty, which made it harder to dismiss. It held something that might have been pity, might have been patience, might have been the specific sorrow of a person who has known an ending was coming for long enough to have already grieved it. "I told you," she said quietly. "I was never meant for your world." She said it back to him, his own words, not with mockery, without it, which was more devastating. Vale inclined his head, a small contained gesture that managed to communicate something that would have taken a lesser man a full sentence, and then he walked with Elara toward the doors. Evan stood in his socks in the lobby of his own building and watched them go some. He spent the next 4 hours on his laptop. His first instinct was legal. He called his attorney, Daniel Kessler, who listened to the situation and told him, with the particular exhaustion of a man who had heard stranger things, that there was no legal mechanism by which a signed divorce was invalid simply because one party turned out to be more complicated than anticipated. The papers were filed. The marriage was dissolved. Whatever Alara Voss had been before she was his wife was, legally speaking, not his problem. Evan hung up and kept digging. He was good at finding things. He had spent his entire professional life understanding that the information people didn't offer was always more important than the information they did. And he had built a network of data brokers and former intelligence consultants who could locate the shape of a person in public records the way archaeologists locate walls, by the empty space around them. He called a man named Dorian, who charged obscene amounts of money and delivered results the same day. Alara Voss, Evan said. Everything before 2019. Give me 2 hours, Dorian said. Dorian called back in 90 minutes. You want the short version or the long version? Dorian said. Start with the short version. The woman you divorced has a different last name. 2 of them, actually. The name she used before Voss, she used in financial and legal documentation across 6 countries between 2013 and 2018. She built routing structures for international capital movement, clean on the surface, sophisticated underneath. The kind of architecture that protects assets from hostile acquisition. The kind of work that takes years and a very particular kind of mind. Evan said nothing. The name she used before that, Dorian continued, was attached to a marriage certificate filed in a private jurisdiction in 2015, joint party on the certificate. A pause. Cassian Vale. The room seemed to change temperature slightly. They were married, Evan said. Legally, privately. It was never dissolved, far as I can find. Another pause. Which means your marriage to her, don't, Evan said, was a civil irregularity at best. At worst, I said don't. Dorian went quiet. He had the professional decency not to complete the sentence. Evan sat in his office with the afternoon light coming through the windows and tried to reconstruct everything he thought he had understood about the last 3 years. Alara had come into his life at a gallery opening, introduced through a mutual connection he had never thought much about. She had been quiet, composed, entirely unremarkable in the way that some women are unremarkable, until you realized that what you were interpreting as plainness was actually the sophisticated absence of performance. She had never spoken about her past in detail. He had attributed this to introversion, to a modest upbringing, to the kind of woman, his father had said approvingly, who knew her place. His father. Evan looked up. Something shifted behind his sternum. Not understanding yet, but the preliminary sensation of understanding, the ground tilting before the building moved. He called Marcus. Get me everything on Alara in the last 72 hours, he said, and pull the files on my father's subsidiary holdings, all of them. He didn't sleep that night. By 2 a.m., he had Dorian's full report and 3 hours of Marcus's compiled surveillance, and what he was looking at did not make sense in the way that things stop making sense when they have been deliberately constructed to obscure. The subsidiary chains his father controlled were not new. He had known about them in the abstract. Wallace Mercer had always kept portions of the company's holdings in separate structures, estate planning, tax efficiency, the kind of financial architecture that legitimate businesses used legally and that sometimes, in certain configurations, served other purposes. Evan had never looked too closely. He was not proud of that now, sitting at his desk at 2 a.m. with the documents in front of him, but he had not looked because Wallace had given him no reason to look. And looking too hard at your own father's finances required a kind of courage that Evan, in his honesty, understood he had been saving for something else. What the document showed was a network, not crude. Nothing about it was crude, which was itself the tell. Shell companies in Delaware and Luxembourg, routing through a Cayman structure, connecting at the far end to an entity that appeared in Dorian's report on Alara's work. The same entity. Not similar. The same. His father's money had been moving through infrastructure that Alara had built, which meant his father had known who Alara was before Evan ever met her. Evan sat very still for a long time. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it because at 2 a.m, with everything collapsing, he had stopped filtering. You found the subsidiary chains, Alara said. Her voice was calm, the way it was always calm, but there was something underneath it tonight that he hadn't heard before. Something pulled tight. He didn't ask how she knew. My father knew who you were, Evan said. From the beginning, she said. He introduced us. He arranged the introduction. Yes. Evan pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. Why? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone delivering information that is going to hurt the person receiving it, and choosing, consciously, to do it cleanly, rather than gently. Because there is a financial instrument, a controlled trust, built into the architecture of the network I designed, that is legally accessible only through a marriage dissolution between specific named parties. Your father knew it existed. He knew the only way to access it was to ensure you married me and then ensured the marriage ended. A breath. The divorce was not his frustration with me. It was the mechanism. Outside the window, somewhere in the harbor, the lights of the black and gold yacht were still visible in the dark water. He used me to steal from you, Evan said. He used both of us, Ilara said, and he didn't expect either of us to figure it out. Evan looked at the papers on his desk, at the subsidiary chains, at the name connecting his father's money to the architecture Ilara had built to protect someone else's empire. There's a problem, Ilara said, and her voice had changed. The tight thing beneath the surface had surfaced now, clean and cold. Your father's access attempt triggered alerts in the network. There are people who are watching those alerts, people who have spent years trying to locate me. A pause that had weight to it. Someone already knew where I was tonight, the apartment on 63rd. There were 2 men in the hallway when I left. Evan stood up from his desk. Are you safe? Another pause, briefer. For now, Ilara said. He heard, in the background of the call, the sound of water, the low structural hum of an engine beneath the waterline. She was on the yacht. Ilara, he said. Yes. I didn't know. She was quiet for a moment. The sound of the water moved through the line between them. I know you didn't, she said. And there was something in the way she said it, not forgiveness exactly, something more complicated than forgiveness. The particular acknowledgement of a person who has learned to separate what someone did from what someone meant, that stayed with him long after she ended the call. He sat in the dark of his office with the document spread in front of him and understood for the first time that the woman he had dismissed as quiet had been the most consequential person in his life from the moment they met. And his father, the man who had taught him to read balance sheets, who had told him that everything could be reduced to a number, had known exactly what she was worth and had spent 3 years moving the pieces into position. He pulled up his phone. He opened a new message to his attorney. Then he stopped. He looked at the documents again, at the subsidiary chains, at his father's name at the top of each holding structure, clear as anything, if you knew how to read it. He would know how to read it. He pulled up the message again. This time, he started typing. The message Evan sent to his attorney at 2:47 in the morning was not what Daniel Kessler expected. It was not a request for counsel. It was not a question about liability or exposure or the legal implications of what Evan had found in his father's subsidiary chains. It was a single sentence, 9 words long, and when Kessler read it at 6 a.m. with his first cup of coffee, he put the cup down and read it again. I need everything you have on Wallace Mercer's private holdings. Kessler called back immediately. Evan didn't answer. He was already in a car heading downtown, and he had turned his phone face down on the seat beside him because he needed 20 minutes to think without anyone requiring him to speak. The city was still dark at the edges, that particular pre-dawn gray that made Manhattan look unfinished, like a sketch of itself. Evan watched it through the window and tried to organize what he knew into something that had a shape. His father had known who Ilara was. His father had engineered their introduction. His father had spent 3 years positioning the marriage like a chess piece, patient and quiet and completely invisible to the one person who should have been watching, his own son. And when the time was right, when whatever financial mechanism his father needed had matured to the point of accessibility, Wallace Mercer had found a way to make Evan believe the divorce was his own idea. That was the part that sat in Evan's chest like something swallowed wrong. He had believed it was his idea. He had stood in his kitchen in his tailored shirt with his cufflinks and his certainty, and he had told Ilara she was never meant for his world, and he had felt, in that moment, like a man making a clear-eyed decision, a man in control of his own life. He had felt almost generous, the way people feel generous when they are doing something that benefits themselves. and can find a framing in which it also benefits the other person. His father had made him feel that way, had likely been cultivating that feeling for months, maybe longer. Small comments about the marriage, quiet observations about compatibility, the particular patience of a man who knew he only needed to water a plant, not force it to grow. The car stopped. Evan got out without waiting for the driver to open the door. The building Cassian Vale's people were using was not what Evan expected. He had been given the address by Alara in a text message sent at 4 a.m. No explanation, just an address in the financial district and the words "come alone." And he had expected something that announced itself. Something with security visible from the street. The architectural equivalent of a warning. What he found was a floor in an office building that looked, from the outside, like any other floor in any other office building. The elevator required a key card that a man in the lobby handed him without a word. The doors opened on the 31st floor, and the first thing Evan registered was the smell. Coffee, real coffee, and something underneath it that might have been gun oil, though he told himself later that was probably his imagination working overtime. The second thing he registered was Alara, sitting at a long table with a laptop open in front of her, and 2 empty coffee cups at her elbow, and she looked like she hadn't slept, which meant she probably hadn't, and there were 2 men standing near the windows whom Evan did not know and did not like the look of. And then there was Cassian Vale. Vale was standing at the far end of the table with a phone to his ear. He looked up when Evan entered, and his expression did not change in any way that Evan could specifically identify, but something shifted in the room. A temperature adjustment, a change in pressure. And the 2 men near the windows moved slightly, subtle repositioning, the way trained people move when a variable enters a space they're responsible for. Vale ended his call. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "sit down." It was not an invitation. It was not quite an order. It was the tone of a man who had spent so long in rooms where his word was the last word that he had lost the ability to distinguish between offering and instructing. Evan had met men like that. Usually he found them irritating. Tonight, he sat down. Alara looked at him across the table. Her eyes moved over his face with the quick assessment of someone checking for damage. "You look like you haven't slept either," she said. "I haven't." "Did you bring the documents?" He put a folder on the table. She pulled it toward her without opening it, set her hand flat on top of it, and looked at Vale. Vale came to the table. He pulled out a chair but didn't sit. He stood behind it, hands resting on the back, and looked at the folder the way a man looks at something he has been waiting to see for long enough that the sight of it carries both relief and new weight. "Walk me through it," Vale said. Evan walked him through it. He kept it factual, kept it ordered, laid out the subsidiary chains and the routing structures and the trust mechanism, the way he would present a financial analysis to a board, without performance, without editorializing, because the facts themselves were sufficiently damaging that decoration would only distract from them. He watched Vale's face as he spoke. Vale's face gave him almost nothing. One moment, when Evan laid out the specific configuration of the trust mechanism, the detail about the dissolution trigger, something moved behind Vale's eyes that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but some compound of both, controlled so quickly it might not have been there at all. When Evan finished, the room was quiet. Vale looked at Alara. "You knew about the trust," Vale said. It was not an accusation. It was a clarification, the specific tone of a man updating a model. "I built the architecture," Alara said. "I didn't build the trust. Someone added it after I left." "After you disappeared." "After I was gone, yes." Vale was quiet. He pulled the chair out and sat down, finally, which for some reason made the room feel more dangerous rather than less, as though the act of sitting was itself a decision, a commitment to a direction that would not be easy to walk back. "The access attempt your father made," Vale said to Evan, "triggered monitoring systems that have been dormant for 6 years. He spoke without looking at Evan, his eyes on the table, which somehow made it worse. "There are 3 organizations that have been watching those systems. 2 of them I have arrangements with. The third—" He stopped. "The third one sent the men to my hallway," Alara said. "Yes." Evan looked between them. "Who are they?" Vale looked at him then. For the first time, directly, without the diplomatic buffer of social courtesy. His eyes were a very pale gray, and they had the quality of eyes that had looked at a great many things and retained the information. "The Drevna family," Vale said. "Out of Prague, operating through Rotterdam. They have wanted access to the network Alara built for the better part of a decade. They have tried to acquire it twice through legitimate channels, and once through means that were not legitimate. A pause. They failed all 3 times because they could not find the architect. They couldn't find me, Alara said. She said it flatly, without pride, the way you state a fact about geography. Your father's access attempt identified the account structure, Vale said to Evan, which identified the origin architecture, which, to anyone with the right analytical tools, points directly to the person who designed it. He picked up the coffee cup in front of him, found it empty, and set it down. Your father did not understand what he was unlocking when he tried to access that trust. He saw a financial mechanism. He did not see that the mechanism was also a beacon. Evan absorbed this. My father put her in danger. Accidentally, Alara said, which doesn't change the result. He put you in danger, Evan said again, and he heard something in his own voice that surprised him. Not the abstract outrage of a man processing information, but something more immediate and less calculated, a reaction that came from somewhere below the part of him that ran on logic. Alara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, back at the laptop. There's something else, she said. Well, the something else took 20 minutes to explain and left Evan feeling as though the floor had changed elevation without warning. Alara had spent the night, the hours between their phone call and his arrival, pulling data from the network's peripheral monitoring systems. Systems that, she explained without apparent emotion, she had designed to be self-sustaining, to continue logging activity even after she stopped maintaining them, like tide gauges left running after the research team has gone home. What the logs showed was not the Drevna family. What the logs showed was internal. Someone within Vale's own organization had been accessing the network's outer monitoring layer for the past 8 months. Not breaking in. They didn't have the access for that, but watching. Observing the alert systems the same way a person watches a door from across the street, waiting for something specific to happen. They were waiting for the dissolution trigger, Alara said. Someone inside your organization knew about the trust, knew it would activate when my marriage to Evan ended, and they have been watching the perimeter, waiting for that activation, for 8 months. The room was very still. Vale's hands, both of them, were flat on the table. 8 months? He said. The first monitoring access was March 14th. I have the logs. Vale's jaw moved, just once, the only visible indication that something behind the composure was under significant pressure. One of the men near the window said something in a language Evan didn't speak. Vale responded without looking at him, 2 words, and the man went quiet. You're saying someone in my organization has been running a parallel operation, Vale said. I'm saying someone in your organization knew about a financial instrument inside a network that was supposed to be known only to you, me, and my father. Alara's voice was steady, but her hands, Evan noticed, were not quite steady. She had pressed them flat on the table the same way Vale had, and the similarity of the gesture struck him. 2 people with the same training in the management of visible reaction. My father has been dead for 4 years, so either you told someone or someone found out on their own. I told no one, Vale said. Then someone found out. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Evan had sat in enough boardrooms to know the difference between the silence of people thinking and the silence of people deciding, and this was the second kind. The silence of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath a structure he has built over many years has been compromised and is now calculating, rapidly and without any visible panic, what that means for everything built on top of it. Vale looked at the 2 men near the window. His look lasted approximately 2 seconds. Both men left the room without being told to, which told Evan something about the organizational culture he had walked into. Leave us, Vale said to the remaining security presence in the room, and that person also left, and then it was just the 3 of them. And Vale looked at Alara, and something passed between them that Evan could not fully read. The compressed communication of 2 people with a long history negotiating something in real time without words. Give me a name, Vale said. Anything in the logs. The access was routed through a proxy chain, Alara said. But the chain has a signature. It's not random. Someone built it deliberately, and whoever built it used methods I recognize. She paused. Methods I taught. Vale's expression shifted by some small increment that, had Evan not been watching closely, he would have missed entirely. You taught those methods to 2 people, Vale said. 3, Alara said, but one of them is dead. The name, when they arrived at it, came sideways, not through the logs themselves, but through a financial record. Evan had brought in the folder, one he had included almost as an afterthought, a subsidiary connection that had seemed marginal in the larger context of his father's network. It was Alara who saw it. She had been going through the folder while Vale made calls in the adjacent room, and she went still in the way that people go still when a pattern resolves. Not dramatically, not with a gasp, but with the complete cessation of all secondary movement, as though the body has redirected all available resources toward a single point. Evan, she said. He leaned over. She pointed at a line in the subsidiary documentation, a company name registered in Malta, that appeared as a pass-through entity in his father's chain. I've seen this entity before, she said. It appears in the network logs, not as an access point, as a beneficiary. Evan looked at the name. What does that mean? It means someone inside Vale's organization has been routing money through your father's subsidiary structure. She sat back. Your father wasn't just trying to access the trust. He was receiving payments. He has been, for at least 2 years. Evan stared at the page. My father was working with someone inside Vale's organization, he said. Yes. Which means the divorce was coordinated, Alara said, from both sides. The door to the adjacent room opened and Vale came back, and he read the atmosphere in the room immediately, the particular kind of stillness that follows a discovery. And he looked at Alara. What did you find? She told him. She laid it out with the same precise flatness she used for everything, and Vale stood in the doorway and listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. Renko, Vale said finally. The word came out differently from his other words, not louder, but with a compression behind it, the sound of something said through significant internal pressure. Alara nodded. Who is Renko? Evan asked. Vale looked at him. For a moment Evan thought he wasn't going to answer, that this was the point at which he would be excused from the room and the real conversation would happen without him. My right hand, Vale said, for 11 years. The weight of that sat in the room. He has access to everything, Vale said. Not a question, a statement of an inventory, spoken aloud, of all the things a man with 11 years of trust had access to. Everything, Alara confirmed. Vale put his hand on the doorframe, just rested it there for a moment. A small gesture that would have meant nothing from another man, but from Vale, from the way he carried himself, communicated something significant. The need, brief and quickly managed, for something solid. He was in the meeting this morning, Vale said. When the alert came in about the Drevna access, he was in the room. A pause. He recommended we reach out to you directly. He was looking at Alara. He suggested the address. The room temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. He knows where we are, Alara said. Yes. Evan was already standing. It was a physical reaction, the body responding before the mind had completed the analysis, the oldest kind of intelligence. Then we need to… Sit down, Vale said. If Renko knows, sit down, Mr. Mercer. Vale's voice had not risen. It hadn't needed to. If Renko wanted this location compromised, he would have done it already. He wants something specific before he moves. That gives us time. He looked at Alara. Not much, but some. Alara was already typing. Her hands were moving across the laptop keyboard with the speed of someone who had a destination in mind. I can lock the trust mechanism, she said. Make it inaccessible from any direction. If Renko's plan depends on the dissolution trigger, he'll know you locked it, Vale said. Yes. And then he'll move. Yes. The word landed with finality. Vale looked at it, at the implication of it, and made a decision. Evan could see the moment it happened, the precise instant when calculation resolved into direction. Then we let him move, Vale said, and we make sure we're ready when he does. He looked at Evan. His pale gray eyes were entirely focused now, all the diplomatic buffer gone. The look of a man assessing an unknown quantity with limited time and a pressing need for accuracy. You said you can get the original documentation on your father's subsidiary chains, the source records, not the summaries. Yes, Evan said. How long? 4 hours, maybe 3. 3, Vale said. We need 3. He straightened up from the doorframe. "And Mr. Mercer, when you retrieve those records, you need to understand what you're doing. This is not a legal proceeding. Whatever those documents show, whatever your father's exposure is, once you hand them to me, the path forward is not through a courthouse." His eyes didn't move. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Evan looked at him. He thought about his father, about the kitchen, about Alara placing her wedding ring on the counter with the same deliberate care she gave to everything, and the expression on her face that he had never been able to decode until he understood that it was the expression of a person who has already finished grieving something that the other person doesn't yet know is lost. "I understand," Evan said. Vale nodded once. He turned back to the adjacent room. 3 hours, he said, without looking back. Evan picked up his jacket. He moved to the elevator. He pressed the call button and stood looking at the closed doors. And in the reflective metal surface, he could see the room behind him. Alara bent over the laptop, fingers moving, and Vale on his phone again in the adjacent room, and the empty chairs around the table where 2 men had been standing half an hour ago and were now gone. The elevator opened. Evan stepped in. The doors closed and he was alone, descending 31 floors through the center of a building in the financial district at 6:45 in the morning, and he understood with a clarity that was not comfortable that he had just agreed to something from which there was no version of retreat that left him as the person he had been yesterday. His father had made him a mechanism, a piece in a structure designed by someone else, moved by someone else's hand, toward an end he had not been consulted about. He was done being a mechanism. He pulled out his phone as the lobby doors opened onto the street. He dialed a number he had memorized and never used, a data contact so far outside his normal network that calling it required a particular kind of decision, the kind that acknowledged you were no longer operating inside the boundaries you had previously assigned yourself. The contact answered on the second ring. "I need Wallace Mercer's private server access," Evan said. "The one he thinks I don't know about." A pause on the line. "That's going to cost you more than money," the contact said. "I know," Evan said. He walked out onto the street. The city was waking up around him. Delivery trucks, early commuters, the ordinary machinery of a morning in which most people were moving through their lives without any awareness that 3 floors up in a building they were passing, a woman was locking a financial mechanism that, once locked, would force a trader's hand. He had 3 hours. He started walking, and he did not look back at the building, because looking back was the instinct of a man who was still uncertain about the direction he had chosen. And Evan Mercer had just decided he was done being uncertain. Behind him, somewhere above the city, in a room with a long table and the smell of cold coffee, Alara's fingers moved across the keyboard, and in a server architecture spread across 6 countries and 3 continents, a door that had been left ajar for 8 months swung shut with a sound that no one in the physical world could hear, but that Renko, wherever he was, would feel the moment his next monitoring ping came back empty. The countdown had started. Neither of them knew exactly what Renko would do when he felt the door close. That was the part that Vale had not said out loud in the room, the part that lived in the pause before he said, "Then we let him move." The acknowledgement, quiet and controlled and entirely without illusion, that forcing a man like Renko into action meant accepting that people in that room might get hurt before it was over. Alara knew it too. She had known it the moment she started typing. She typed anyway. The lock went in at 7:14 in the morning. Alara hit the final key sequence, and somewhere in the distributed architecture she had built a decade ago with a younger version of herself that still believed in clean solutions, a gate closed. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen and waited for the confirmation ping, and when it came, 3 seconds later, green, clean, she let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for approximately 6 hours. Then she picked up her phone and called Vale. "It's done," she said. "How long before he detects it?" Vale said. He was somewhere else in the building. She could hear different acoustics, harder surfaces. "Depends on his monitoring interval. If he's checking manually, hours. If he has an automated alert," she paused. "Less." "Assume less," Vale said. "Always assume less." He ended the call. Alara set the phone on the table and looked at the laptop screen for another moment, at the confirmation indicator sitting quiet and green in the corner of the interface, and thought about Renko. She had met him twice. Once at a meeting in Zurich that Vale had brought her to years ago, before everything changed, when she was still part of that world in an official capacity. Once by accident, in a corridor, when she was leaving and he was arriving and they had passed each other, and he had nodded with the specific courtesy of a man who makes it a practice to be pleasant to everyone, because pleasantness costs nothing and reveals nothing. She had not liked him. She had not been able to say why at the time. Some things you register below the level of language, and you file them away because you have no framework for them yet. And then years later, the framework arrives and you understand what you were sensing. He had known who she was. That was what she understood now. Both times she had seen him, he had already known exactly who she was and what she had built and what it was worth. And he had said nothing, done nothing, simply nodded in a corridor and filed the information away with the patience of a man who could wait as long as the situation required. 11 years of patience, right next to Vale. She closed the laptop. Evan's contact came through in 2 hours and 17 minutes, which was faster than promised, and suggested either genuine capability or genuine fear, and Evan suspected both. He sat in the back of a car parked 3 blocks from his father's primary office building, and went through the server files on a secured tablet that the contact had couriered to him at a coffee shop on Fulton Street, with the particular efficiency of a transaction conducted entirely without eye contact. The files were substantial: 4 years of private financial communications, internal memos, transfer records, the kind of documentation that Wallace Mercer kept off the main company servers for the same reason people keep certain things out of their living rooms. The first hour was dense and slow. His father's filing logic was not his own. Wallace Mercer organized information the way he organized everything, with a surface appearance of order that concealed a deeper idiosyncrasy, categories that made sense only to the person who created them. Evan had grown up watching his father's mind work, and had spent his adult life consciously building his own systems in opposition to it, cleaner and more transparent, and this was the first time that difference had cost him rather than served him. He found the Renko connection 40 minutes in. It wasn't labeled. Nothing about it was direct. It was a series of communications routed through a third-party legal entity, the language carefully neutral, the kind of correspondence that would read as ordinary business exchange to anyone without the context of what they were looking for. But Evan had the context now, and what he was reading was a 2-year dialogue between his father and a man identified only by an account number that matched precisely one of the beneficiary identifiers Ilara had pulled from the network logs. They had not been working together in the way Evan had initially understood, not as partners with a shared goal. What the correspondence showed was more complex and, in its way, more disturbing. Renko had approached Wallace Mercer approximately 26 months ago with a specific proposition. He would provide ongoing intelligence about Vale's organization, movements, financial positions, internal vulnerabilities, in exchange for access to a particular financial instrument that Wallace could activate through a mechanism Renko explained in terms that assumed a degree of financial sophistication Wallace Mercer only partly possessed. The trust. The dissolution trigger. Wallace had agreed without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. That much was visible in the correspondence. The places where his father asked clarifying questions that revealed the gaps in his comprehension, and the places where Renko's answers smoothed over those gaps without actually filling them, giving Wallace enough to feel informed without giving him enough to see the full picture. His father had been used too. Evan sat with that for a moment. He had come into this morning ready to be finished with Wallace Mercer, ready to hand over documentation that would expose his father and let whatever consequence was appropriate arrive without interference from him. He had thought he was prepared for what the files would show. He had not been prepared for this, for the specific shape of his father's culpability, which was not the culpability of a man who had made a calculated decision to destroy his daughter-in-law, but the culpability of a man who had made a greedy decision without understanding its full weight, who had agreed to something he thought he controlled, and discovered too late that the control had always been elsewhere. Wallace Mercer had not known Lara would be in danger. He had not known about the Drevna family, or the monitoring systems, or the beacon effect of the access attempt. He had known he was doing something that would hurt Ilara financially, and he had decided that was acceptable because he had decided Ilara was acceptable damage. That was still a thing his father had done. It was not excused by incomplete information, but it was different from what Evan had believed an hour ago, and the difference mattered to him in a way he didn't have time to fully examine. He called Vale. "There's more," he said. "I need to come back." I was halfway to the building when his phone rang with an unknown number. He answered it on reflex, the same way he had answered Alara's call the night before, and heard a voice he didn't recognize, male, accented, deliberate. "Mr. Mercer," the voice said, don't go back to that building." Evan stopped walking. "Who is this?" "Someone who has been watching this situation for longer than you have." A pause that felt calibrated. "The building on Fulton is compromised. Renko's people flagged your contact's courier 2 hours ago. They know what you retrieved. They know where you're taking it." Evan's hand tightened on the phone. "Who are you?" "That's not important right now. What's important is that you understand the lock Alara put in place this morning did not go undetected. Renko's automated monitoring flagged it within 12 minutes. He is not waiting to move. He has already moved." The street around Evan continued its ordinary business. A delivery truck double-parked, a woman walking a dog, a cab accelerating through yellow light. And all of it seemed suddenly very far away, taking place on the other side of a membrane that separated the world where those things mattered from the world he was currently standing in. "Is she safe?" Evan said. "Vale's people are good," the voice said. "But Renko has 11 years of knowing exactly how good they are and where their gaps are. That's the problem with fighting someone who has been inside your house that long." Another calibrated pause. "I can get you to them. Different route. But you need to decide now." "Why are you helping me?" The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, something in its quality had shifted very slightly. Not warmth exactly, but the sound of a person who has dropped one layer of professional neutrality without dropping the rest. "Because Alara Voss designed a network that protected a great many people over many years," the voice said. "And the people whose job it is to dismantle organizations like Renko's have been waiting for documentation like what you're carrying for a very long time." A pause. "Federal Task Force. We've been running a parallel investigation for 14 months. I can't tell you more than that on an open line." Evan stood on the sidewalk. The cab had made the light. The woman with the dog had turned a corner. The delivery truck's driver was arguing with someone over a clipboard. "Route," Evan said. The route took 35 minutes and involved 2 car changes and a building. He entered through a service entrance. The agent, a woman, late 30s, who identified herself only as Sorrel, met him at the second car change and said nothing for most of the drive except the minimum necessary to navigate. She had the quality of competence that expressed itself through economy. Every movement purposeful, nothing performed. When they were 2 minutes out, she spoke. "Vale's people moved Alara when the alert came in," Sorrel said. "They're in a secondary location. We've had eyes on it for 6 months. It's clean. Renko doesn't know it. But the primary building took a team." She glanced at him in the mirror. 3 of Vale's security are in hospital. 1 of Renko's people is dead." The information arrived in Evan's body before it arrived in his mind. He felt it in his shoulders and chest before he understood what it meant. The physical comprehension of violence, of the gap between the world of documents and server files he had been operating in and the world where people moved through buildings doing things to each other. "Alara," he said. "She wasn't in the building when it happened," Sorrel said. "Vale got her out 20 minutes before. He anticipated." A brief pause. "Vale is very good at anticipating." "But he didn't anticipate Renko." Sorrel said nothing, which was its own answer. The secondary location was a floor in a building that Evan would later realize he had sold to a shell company 3 years ago, part of a mid-market commercial real estate transaction he had processed without particular attention. The coincidence was the kind of thing that stops being coincidence when you understand that Alara had probably known who owned it. She was standing when he came in, not sitting, not at a laptop, standing near the window with her arms crossed and her weight slightly forward, the posture of someone who has been waiting and does not enjoy waiting. She looked at him when he entered, and the relief on her face was brief and genuine and quickly replaced with the composed attention she used as a default. But he had seen it, the half-second of it, and he filed it away. Vale was in the room. Vale's face was controlled in the way that Evan had learned, over the past 12 hours, to read as a sign of significant internal activity. The more controlled the face, the more was happening underneath it. There was a third person Evan didn't recognize. A man in his 50s, compact, with the specific stillness of someone who had been sitting in rooms like this one for his entire career and had long since stopped being disturbed by them. "This is Harlan," Vale said. He is the only person in this room whose last name I do not know. Harlan looked at Evan with eyes that had seen a great deal and were not sharing their impressions. Evan understood that Sorrel's organization and Harlan were connected. He didn't say so. What happened at the building? Evan said. Renko sent 4 people, Vale said, not to recover anything, to destroy the server access Alara was using and to acquire the copies of your father's documentation. He looked at the tablet in Evan's hand. They found empty tables and 3 of my security staff who gave them significantly more trouble than they expected. A breath. It was a message, not an extraction. A message. He wanted us to know he was past patience. Or he wanted us distracted, Alara said from the window. Everyone looked at her. Think about the target selection, she said. He sent 4 people to a location that had 8 of Vale's security staff. That's not an attack designed to succeed. That's an attack designed to occupy. She turned from the window. While we were dealing with the building, what were we not watching? The silence had a specific character. The character of people running a rapid inventory of everything they were not watching. Vale's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a single degree of shift. But Evan had been watching Vale's face closely enough now to know that a single degree from that face was equivalent to a full expression change from anyone else. He answered, listened for 30 seconds, said nothing, ended the call. The yacht, he said. The yacht had not been attacked. That was the first thing Vale clarified, and Evan registered the relief in the room before Vale continued, and then the relief became something else entirely. The yacht had been boarded, selectively, surgically, by people who knew exactly where to go and exactly how long they had, which meant people who had been given information about the vessel's security rotation from someone who knew it intimately. They had taken one thing. In a sealed compartment in Vale's private quarters, in a case that required biometric access and a 6-digit code, there had been a physical document, original, single copy, the only existing record of an agreement made 15 years ago that formally established Alara's legal status within Vale's organization and the legal framework of their marriage. The document that proved, in terms that no court could dismiss, that Alara had acted under formal agreement rather than independent criminal enterprise. The document that was, in legal terms, the only thing standing between her and a federal conspiracy charge if the network's history was ever fully examined. Renko had taken it. The room absorbed this in stages. Alara's arms came uncrossed. She put her hands flat at her sides, and her face did something that Evan had not seen it do before. Not grief, not anger, but a kind of stripped quality, the expression of someone who has just watched a wall come down that they had believed was structural and is now standing in the open. He took the only thing that protects me, she said. Her voice was even. The evenness of it was terrible. Yes, Vale said. He's not going to use it to expose me, she said. It was not a question. She was thinking out loud, working through it in real time, and the speed of her reasoning was visible even in crisis, the mind moving fast and not stopping to perform its distress. If he exposes me, the federal case against the network begins, and Renko is inside the network. He'd be burning himself. She looked at Vale. He's going to use it to control me. He's going to offer to return it in exchange for something. Or he's going to use it to control me, Vale said quietly, by threatening you. The room was very still. Same result, Alara said. Either way, he has a lever. Harlan, who had said nothing since Evan arrived, shifted in his chair. It was the small shift of a man with something to add who has been waiting for the right moment. There's a third option, Harlan said. Everyone looked at him. Renko doesn't use it as leverage, Harlan said. He uses it as a foundation. He has been building something for 11 years. Not just a betrayal, but a replacement. He wants Vale's organization, not destroyed, taken. He looked at Vale with the steady gaze of someone delivering information that is accurate and unwelcome. The document proves Alara's legal standing, but it also proves the organization's legal framework. In the right hands, with the right filing, in a jurisdiction where Vale's structure is registered, that document could be used to argue a transfer of organizational authority. That Alara, as the legally documented founder of the network architecture, has standing to authorize a leadership transition. The silence was absolute. He's not taking it to threaten you, Harlan said to Alara. He's taking it to use you, your signature. voluntary or otherwise. Alara looked at Harlan for a long moment. Her face had gone through several iterations in the past 90 seconds, and had now arrived somewhere that was past shock, past the first wave of it, into the colder territory on the other side. The territory where you stop reacting to what has happened and start calculating what happens next. "He needs me alive," she said. "Yes." "And compliant." "Yes." She looked at Vale. Something passed between them. That compressed communication again, the shorthand of people with a long shared history, but this time with a weight to it that was new, the weight of a situation that had just exceeded the boundaries of what either of them had planned for. "He'll make contact," Vale said. "He'll frame it as a negotiation." "And if we don't negotiate?" Vale was quiet. "If we don't negotiate," Harlan said carefully, "he files the document himself, argues the transfer in a jurisdiction that's sympathetic to the claim. It won't succeed in the long run. We have counter-documentation. But the legal disruption alone would be enough to freeze the organization's assets for 18 to 24 months. He paused. "During which time Renko operates freely with the organization's existing infrastructure." "So we negotiate," Evan said. Everyone looked at him. He had not spoken in several minutes, and the sound of his voice seemed to recalibrate the room slightly, a reminder that he was there. "We negotiate," he said again, "and we use the negotiation as the window we need." He looked at Harlan. "Your task force has been building a case for 14 months. What do you need to close it?" Harlan studied him. "The internal communications, Renko's connection to the Drevna family, documented and authenticated, and a witness with direct knowledge of the organization's structure who is willing to testify under a protection agreement." Evan looked at Vale. Vale's expression was unreadable, but he didn't look away. "If he agrees to testify," Evan said to Harlan, "you offer full immunity for the legitimate restructuring. Everything from the point of agreement forward is clean." "That's not my call alone," Harlan said. "Then make the call," Evan said. "You have an hour before Renko makes contact, and we have to decide whether we're walking into that conversation with a plan or without one." Harlan looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man reassessing an initial categorization. Then he picked up his phone and stepped out of the room. Vale watched him go. Then he turned to look at Evan with the pale gray eyes that gave away so little, and for a moment said nothing at all. "You understand what you just proposed," Vale said. It was not a question. "I understand," Evan said. "If I testify, everything I have built, the parts that are not clean, is finished." "Yes." "The legitimate structure survives. The rest is already finished," Evan said. "Renko made sure of that when he decided to take it. You're not choosing between keeping it and losing it. You're choosing between losing it on your terms or losing it on his." Vale looked at him for a long time. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Then Vale turned to Alara. She was looking at Evan with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the unreadable, composed mask, not the stripped-open look from a few minutes ago, but something in between, something that lived in the specific register of a person witnessing an action from someone they had written off and finding themselves required to revise. Vale looked at her for a moment, then looked away, at the window, at the city visible through it, the ordinary Tuesday morning going on outside. "Make the call," he said. "To no one in particular, or to all of them." His phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened by 1 degree. "That's not our call," Alara said quietly. "That's Renko." Vale picked up the phone. He looked at Evan, looked at Alara, and in his pale gray eyes something had resolved. The calculation was done, the direction was chosen, and what was left was the quality of a man who has decided and is no longer managing the decision, but simply executing it. He answered. "Renko," he said. His voice was entirely even. "You should have stayed patient a little longer." The voice on the other end said something. Vale listened. His face gave nothing, but his free hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist that then opened again, finger by finger, the smallest possible expression of what was happening inside a man who had just heard something that confirmed his worst calculation and is choosing, consciously, not to let it show. He looked at Alara when the voice stopped, and Alara, watching his face, understood before he said a word what Renko had told him. Because the thing that Vale was controlling in that moment, the thing that was visible only in the hand opening and closing on the table, was not anger. It was fear. And Vale afraid meant that whatever Renko had just said was not a threat about documents or organizations or leverage points. It was something about her, something that Renko had been holding for longer than 8 months, something that changed everything about what they thought they knew. Vale's hand opened on the table, all 5 fingers, flat, deliberate. Then he said one word into the phone. "Where?" Renko told him. Vale listened without moving, without any visible reaction, and when the call ended, he set the phone on the table with the controlled precision of a man placing down something he wants to throw. The room waited. "He has the document," Vale said, "and he has something else." He looked at Alara, and the look lasted 1 second longer than it needed to, which from Vale was the equivalent of a full confession. He has been in contact with a clinic in Geneva, a private facility that treated a patient under a protected identity 4 years ago. A pause that had mass to it. The patient was listed under a name that no longer exists in any active record, but Renko has the intake files. Alara's face did not change. It held its shape with the extraordinary muscular discipline of a person who has been trained by experience to keep their face still, but her color changed. Something left it, some underlying warmth. And that was visible. That was the tell. And Evan saw it and understood that whatever this was, it was not new information to Alara. It was old information, old and protected, and believed to be buried. "What was the patient's name?" Evan said. Vale looked at him, then at Alara. Alara answered. Her voice was completely flat. "Mine," she said. "My original name, the one before everything else." She moved away from the window, came to the table, and sat down with the deliberate economy of someone managing a physical response. 4 years ago, I was treated for a condition that required extended inpatient care. The treatment was successful. The records were sealed under a private agreement with the facility. The name on the intake forms, my original name, connects me to a documented identity that Renko can use to reconstruct my entire history. Every alias, every account structure, every legal framework. She put her hands on the table. They were steady. If he files that with the relevant federal authorities alongside the organizational document, I am not a witness. I am a subject. Harlan came back into the room. He read the atmosphere and stopped inside the door. "The immunity offer," he said carefully. "It covers the organization's structure, going forward." He looked at Alara. "Not prior identity-based exposure." "I know," Alara said. "Then we have a problem." "We have always had a problem," Alara said. "We just now know its exact shape." Evan looked at her, at the hands on the table, at the specific quality of stillness she was projecting with every available resource, the effort of it visible only in the slight tightness around her jaw, the way her shoulders were held precisely, rather than naturally. "Where does Renko want to meet?" Evan said to Vale. "The yacht," Vale said. "Tonight." He specified the yacht. "He specified your ground," Evan said. "He specified the ground he knows best," Vale said. 11 years of coming aboard that vessel. He knows every corridor, every station, every rotation." His jaw moved. "He is telling me he has turned my strength into his advantage." "Then we change the advantage," Evan said. The next 4 hours were the most focused of Evan's life, which was saying something, because Evan Mercer had spent 20 years in high-stakes financial negotiations where the margins were narrow and the consequences of error were measured in the hundreds of millions. But those negotiations had taken place on familiar ground, with known rules, with the implicit understanding that everyone in the room was operating within a system that, however adversarial, had boundaries. This had no boundaries. Harlan's task force could not formally participate. Harlan was explicit about this. His authorization extended to surveillance and documentation, not intervention, and any overt action by federal personnel before the immunity agreement was finalized would compromise the entire 14-month case. He could have eyes near the yacht. He could have a boat in the harbor with recording capability. He could not put people on the deck. Vale's security was reduced. 3 people in hospital, 2 more pulled off active duty after the building breach. The team depleted and reorganized in the past 6 hours, running on adrenaline and contingency protocols that had not been designed for a threat from inside. Alara spent 90 minutes on the laptop and then closed it and said she had done everything she could from the technical side. She said it without elaboration, which meant the technical side was either sufficient or not, and they would not know which until it mattered. Evan used the remaining time to call his father. He had been putting it off. He was aware of putting it off. There was a version of what he was about to do that did not involve calling Wallace Mercer first, that simply moved forward and let the consequences land where they landed, and he had been occupying that version for most of the morning because it was easier than the alternative. He made the call from a corner of the room, voice low, back to the others. Wallace answered on the third ring. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has spent the day monitoring his phone for a call he expected and dreaded. Evan. You knew her before I met her, Evan said. No opening, no structure, just the fact, delivered flat. Silence. Dad. It wasn't... His father stopped, started again. It was a financial opportunity. I didn't know it would... Did you know she would be in danger? The silence this time was of a different character. Not the silence of a man formulating a defense, but the silence of a man confronting the specific version of himself that made a decision and chose not to look at its full implications because looking would have required him to not make it. I didn't think anyone would get hurt, Wallace said. That's not the same as not knowing. His father said nothing. There's a meeting tonight, Evan said. I need you to do something. You're not going to like it, and you don't have a choice. He laid it out in 3 sentences. What was needed, what it would cost, what happened if Wallace refused. He kept his voice level. He felt, while he spoke, that he was talking to someone he had known his entire life and was only now meeting. When he finished, his father was quiet for a long time. If I do this, Wallace said, the company is already finished, Evan said. Renko has been using it for 2 years. It's been compromised since before I knew any of this. The question is whether what's left of it is used to do something decent before it's gone. A breath. That's the only question left, Dad. Another silence. Longer. Right, Wallace said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. Some weight that had been there so long it had become structural, and its absence made him sound older and, in some way Evan couldn't name, more like himself. Tell me what you need. What? The storm came in off the water at 6 p.m. It was not a violent storm. No lightning, no dramatic weather event quality to it. Just a sustained heavy rain that reduced visibility on the harbor to 100 meters and turned the yacht's deck into a surface of moving water under the dock lights. The kind of weather that was useful if you were planning to move people and equipment without wanting to be clearly visible, and inconvenient if you were planning to control a space you already knew. Renko had specified 9 p.m. They boarded at 8:15. Vale went first. He walked up the gangway with 2 security staff and nothing in his expression that communicated anything other than a man returning to his own vessel, which was what he was. And the 2 dock workers who were Renko's people noted it, and noted the security staff and made the calculation that this was expected. Vale knew they were there. He had known for 3 hours, from the moment Harlan's surveillance team identified them. Elara went up through the service entrance on the port side, alone, with a waterproof case over her shoulder that contained a laptop and a secondary device she had spent an hour configuring. She moved quickly, without running, her shoes quiet on the wet deck, and she was below before the dock workers completed their next check rotation. Evan went last. He had no role in what Vale and his security would do on the main deck. His role was below, with Elara, doing the thing that Renko had not anticipated because Renko's model of Evan Mercer was built on 3 years of watching a man who went where his father's structures directed him and called that living. The rain was cold. It hit the back of his neck when he crossed the gangway and ran down inside his collar, and he didn't stop to adjust anything, just kept moving, because stopping on the gangway was the thing you didn't do. And he had decided tonight that every instinct toward hesitation was going to be overridden by forward motion until the thing was done, or it wasn't. He made it below decks. Elara was already at a panel in the communications room, the secondary device connected to the yacht's broadcast system, through a hard line she had routed while he was still outside. She looked up when he came in. Her hair was wet at the edges. She looked focused in the specific way of someone doing a technical task that requires all available attention and is doing it correctly. How long? He said. 20 minutes to have the broadcast system ready, maybe less. She looked back at the panel. The financial records are loaded. Harlan's team confirmed the receiving channels are open. She connected something, checked the connection. When I broadcast, it goes to every monitoring frequency in use by every organization watching this harbor tonight. Renko's contacts, the Drevna family's contacts, the task force. She paused. And every major financial intelligence network in the northeastern region. And Renko's leverage, Evan said. The document. The Geneva records. If what your father sent us is what he said it is, Elara said, then yes. Releasing the financial records simultaneously with the counter-documentation framework makes the Geneva records legally unusable. There's nothing to attach them to. She didn't look up. It's a narrow window. Everything has to go out simultaneously, or the sequencing gives Renko time to respond. And your father's contribution, Evan said. She was quiet for a moment, her hand stilled on the panel. He sent a sworn statement, she said, without inflection. Documenting the approach Renko made 2 years ago, the proposition, the terms, everything. She resumed working. A 73-year-old man wrote out a 3-page statement tonight and sent it through his personal attorney at 7 p.m. She connected a final cable. It's more than I expected from him. Above them, the storm pressed against the hull. The sound of it was low and continuous, a kind of white noise that made the communications room feel sealed off from everything outside it. 9 minutes, Elara said. Evan checked his phone. No messages from Vale. No messages from Harlan. The absence of communication was either good or not. There was no way to know from here, below the waterline, in the sealed quiet of the communications room, while the rain worked on the hull above them. Then his phone buzzed. Vale. Vale. One word, he's here. What? Renko came aboard at 8:51. He came with 6 people, which was 4 more than the 2 Vale had been led to expect, and the fact of those 4 extra bodies communicated something that Vale registered the moment he saw them. This was not a negotiation. This had never been a negotiation. The word negotiation had been a container for a conversation that was always going to end the same way, on Renko's terms, because Renko's model of this situation was a situation in which Vale had no remaining leverage and would accept the terms offered rather than lose everything to a filing he couldn't stop. Vale stood on the main deck in the rain and watched Renko cross the gangway and felt the particular sensation of a man looking at someone he trusted for 11 years and finding the face familiar and the person behind it entirely unknown, and understanding that this is not a revelation, it is an accounting. You are paying now for what you chose not to look at then. Renko was 60. He looked at tonight in a way he had not always looked at. Some decision had been made, some management of appearance set aside, as though the maintenance of a persona requires more energy than he currently wanted to spend. He was wearing a gray jacket that was getting wet in the rain, and he hadn't moved to avoid the rain, which was itself a statement. He had made it, and he didn't need to stay dry. Cashin, he said, the familiarity of the name, the diminutive, the 11 years of earned address. It landed differently now, each syllable landing like a specific item catalogued and reconsidered. Victor, Vale said. They looked at each other in the rain for a moment. You brought more people than we agreed, Vale said. I changed the agreement, Renko said. That's what tonight is about, actually, changing agreements. He looked around the deck, the security stations, the rigging, the rain-slicked surfaces he had walked 100 times. Where is she? Below, Vale said. I want her on deck. You'll have her when we've discussed terms. Renko's mouth moved slightly. Not a smile. A recognition. There are no terms, Cashin. There is a resolution. I present the resolution, you accept the resolution. That's the meeting. He gestured to one of his people, who moved toward the interior hatch. Vale's security moved to intercept. The deck went very still. 6 bodies against Vale's 2, in the rain, with the harbor gray and invisible behind the weather. And for approximately 4 seconds, nobody moved, and the sound of the rain on the deck and the rigging was the only sound. Then the lights went out. Every deck light, every interior light visible through the portholes, all of it cut simultaneously, cleanly, without warning, and the yacht was dark except for the harbor ambient light that filtered through the rain, and in that sudden dimness the geometry of the deck changed entirely. Renko said something in Czech. Sharp, short, not a word Evan would have understood even if he'd been on deck. Below, in the communications room, Elara had killed the vessel's lighting through the same system panel she had used to access the broadcast architecture. She had told Evan this was the signal. When the lights went out, they had 90 seconds before Renko's people located the emergency lighting switches and restored visibility. "Now," she said. Evan hit send. The broadcast went out at 9:03 p.m. across 14 simultaneous frequencies. It contained four things: the complete subsidiary chain documentation from Wallace Mercer's private server, Renko's 2-year communication record with Wallace Mercer establishing the conspiracy, Vale's organizational framework authenticated under the original legal agreement, and Wallace Mercer's sworn statement, 3 pages, handwritten, signed, and notarized at 7:45 that evening by a 73-year-old man sitting at his desk doing the only useful thing left available to him. Alara watched the transmission confirmation come back on each channel. Green, 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 green. The indicators lit up across the screen like something being resolved one piece at a time, and she made a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite anything else, and pressed her hand flat on the panel for a moment. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Evan's footsteps. Evan was standing 2 feet from her and had not moved. She turned. The door to the communications room opened, and one of Renko's people was standing in it. Not the door they had come in through, the other door, the one that accessed the forward corridor, the one that Alara had noted when she boarded and assessed as a secondary entry point, and then set aside because she had believed the layout gave them sufficient control. She had been wrong about the forward corridor. The man in the door had a flashlight in one hand and was reaching for something at his side with the other. Evan moved. He was not trained. He had never been trained. But he was across the room in 3 steps with a momentum that surprised the man in the door, who had been expecting the occupants of the room to freeze, which is what most people do, and Evan did not freeze. He collided with the man at an angle that was not tactical, not calculated, not anything except the full physical commitment of someone who has decided that stopping is worse than whatever happens if you don't stop. They went into the wall of the corridor. The flashlight hit the floor. The man was larger than Evan and recovered faster than Evan expected, and what followed was ugly and close and not in any way resembling a fight scene. It was 2 people in a narrow corridor in the dark, both breathing hard, both operating on the rawest available version of their instincts, and what determined the outcome was not skill, but the fact that Alara came through the door behind Evan and hit the man in the back of the knee with the edge of the waterproof case with a force that folded his leg and brought him down, and Evan, who was still holding the man's jacket collar with both hands, used the downward momentum to put him into the floor and keep him there. The man stopped fighting. Evan was breathing like he'd been underwater. Alara looked at the man on the floor, then at Evan. Her chest was moving fast. There was a scrape on her forearm that was bleeding slightly from the edge of the doorframe. "Can you hold him?" she said. "Yes," Evan said. She went back into the communications room. She had 3 things left to do and 40 seconds before the emergency lighting came on, and Renko understood what had happened below decks. She did all 3 in 31 seconds. The last thing she did was lock the organizational document, Vale's copy, the authenticated framework, into a federal evidence archive that Harlan's team had opened for exactly this purpose. A chain of custody so clear and so immediate that Renko's physical copy of the document became, in the legal sense, a counterfeit the moment the lock completed. She stood up from the panel. On the deck above them, she could hear voices. Multiple voices. The emergency lighting had come on. She could see it through the porthole, the cold blue-white of the backup system spreading across the rain-wet deck. She could hear Vale's voice. She could not hear what he was saying. Then another voice, louder. Renko, she thought, the particular carry of a man who has just understood that something has gone wrong and is choosing to express that understanding as authority rather than panic. Then a third voice. Not Vale, not Renko. A woman's voice, steady and carrying, identifying herself clearly and without hesitation. Sorrel. Harlan's team was on the deck. "We need to move," Alara said to Evan. He got up from the floor. The man underneath him didn't try to rise. Evan looked at his hands, scraped, both of them, the right one worse, and flexed them once and left the corridor. They went up the stairs together, and when they came through the hatch onto the main deck, the rain hit them both at the same time, cold and immediate, and the scene in front of them was the specific controlled chaos of a situation being brought under restraint. Renko's 6 people at various points of surrender or standoff. Vale's 2 security staff plus Sorrel's 3. Everyone wet, everyone tense, everyone operating at the exact level of adrenaline that makes ordinary movement look deliberate and deliberate movement look slow. Renko was standing at the far end of the deck near the stern railing. He was looking at Alara, not at Vale, not at Sorrel, not at the agents now moving across the deck. At Alara, directly and with an attention so complete it functioned like a physical pressure. The look of a man who has spent years working towards something and is now watching it resolve in the wrong direction and is trying, with everything available to him, to find the place where it can still be turned. Alara walked toward him. Vale moved to follow. She stopped him with one hand on his arm, briefly, without looking at him. A gesture that was not dramatic, just clear, the clarity of someone who has decided that this particular thing belongs to them. She walked across the wet deck in the rain, past Sorrel's people, past the standoff at the port rail, until she was 10 feet from Renko and stopped. He looked at her. The calculation behind his eyes was still running. She could see it, the rapid adjustment of models, the search for the remaining lever, the refusal to accept a closed door. "The Geneva records," she said. "You still have them?" "Yes," he said. "They connect to an identity that no longer has a legal framework to attach to," she said. "The broadcast closed it, you know that." He said nothing. "So what you have," she said, "is a document about a woman who got sick 4 years ago and got better. That's all it is now." She looked at him directly, without the managed composure, without the careful neutrality. Just her face, the actual version of it, tired and wet and entirely done with the management of what she let show. "Was it worth 11 years? Renko looked at her for a long moment. "Ask me that question," he said quietly, "when you understand what he took from me." It was the first thing he had said that did not function as leverage or instruction. It was the first thing that came from somewhere personal, and it landed differently than everything else. And Alara heard it. She heard it the way you hear something that doesn't change what is happening, but adds a dimension to it, puts a human weight behind the damage that doesn't excuse the damage, but refuses to let it be simple. She didn't answer. Sorrel appeared at her shoulder. "Mr. Renko," Sorrel said, "I need you to come with me." Renko looked at Alara for another moment. Then he looked at Vale, who was standing 20 feet away, and something passed between them. Not the compressed communication of allies, but the final transmission between two people who had been close for a long time and were now on opposite sides of something that could not be undone. Vale held his gaze. Renko looked away first. Sorrel guided him toward the gangway, and Alara stood on the wet deck and watched him go. And beside her, Vale came to stand, not touching her, just present, the way he was always present, without demand, without performance, just there. The rain continued. On the deck, Sorrel's people were processing the scene with methodical efficiency. Harlan was on his phone at the rail, his voice low, running the chain of custody confirmation. Evan was standing near the hatch with his scraped hands at his sides, looking at the city lights visible through the rain in the harbor. And Alara looked at him and thought about the man who had signed divorce papers in a kitchen and told her she was never meant for his world. He had crossed a corridor in the dark and put a man on the floor. He had called his father. He had hit send. She thought about the word worth, Renko's word, directed at Vale, carrying 11 years of something she didn't have the full shape of and might never have. She thought about the things people do in the name of what they believe they were owed, and how much damage those things leave behind when the believing is done. The harbor was dark and rain churned around the hull. Below decks, in the communications room, the confirmation indicators sat green across 14 channels, steady and unblinking, the most ordinary-looking evidence of a collapse that had taken years to build and 31 seconds to complete. Vale looked at the city. "It's done," he said. Not to her specifically. To the night. Alara looked at the rain. "Not yet," she said. Because Harlan was still on his phone at the rail, and the expression on his face had changed in the last 30 seconds. She could see it from where she stood, the shift from confirmation mode to something else, the particular attention of a person receiving information that was not expected. And when he turned to look at her across the deck, she knew that whatever he had just been told was not a detail. It was the piece they hadn't known they were missing. And its arrival meant that what she had believed was the end of tonight was, in fact, the last moment before the final thing revealed itself. Harlan walked across the wet deck with his phone still in his hand and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has received information that requires him to reorder several things he believed were settled. He stopped in front of Alara. He looked at Vale, then back at Alara. "The Geneva Clinic," he said. "We ran the name from the intake files, the original name on your records, through our existing case documentation." A pause in which he seemed to be selecting his words with more than usual care. "It matched a name in a separate federal file. Not ours. DEA, running a parallel thread on the Drevna family's financial infrastructure." He looked at her steadily. "The Drevna family has known who you are for longer than we thought. Not 8 months. Closer to 3 years." The rain came down. Alara absorbed this without visible reaction for approximately 4 seconds. Then something moved through her expression. Not fear, not even surprise, but the particular quality of a person recalculating a timeline and finding that a decision they made 3 years ago, which they believed was free, was made inside a situation they didn't have full visibility of. "3 years ago," she said. "That's when I left." "Yes," Harlan said. "We believe your departure from the network, your disappearance, was not as clean as you thought it was. Someone at the Geneva Clinic sold the intake information, not to Renko, to the Drevna family directly." He paused. "Renko bought it from them 18 months ago, which is why his monitoring started when it did. He had the Geneva records first, and he used them to locate the network perimeter, and then he waited." Vale said, "If the Drevna family has had this information for 3 years, they've been building their own case," Harlan said. "Not a legal case, a leverage case. They have been assembling documentation on the network's architecture with the intention of using it to absorb the operation rather than dismantle it." He looked at the harbor. "We intercepted a communication 40 minutes ago. The Drevna family's Eastern Operations Director is currently on a flight, landing at Newark in 90 minutes. The deck was quiet except for the rain and the low movement of water against the hull. "He's coming to collect," Alara said. "He's coming because the broadcast went out," Harlan said. "Your broadcast destabilized the network's outer structure. To the Drevna family, that looks like an opportunity, a vacuum they can move into before the dust settles. They are not coming to negotiate. They are coming because they believe the situation is momentarily leaderless and they have 3 years of intelligence on it." He looked at Alara directly. "And because they believe you are the key to operating it." Vale's face had gone to its most controlled configuration. Evan, standing near the hatch, had his arms crossed and his eyes moving between Harlan and Alara with the focused attention of someone tracking a situation that is not finished resolving. 90 minutes, Vale said. "Yes." "Then we have 90 minutes, Vale said, "to make sure that when he lands, there is nothing here worth collecting." What followed was not elegant. None of it was not elegant. None of it was elegant. And later, much later, when Alara tried to reconstruct the sequence, what she remembered most clearly was not the decisions themselves, but the texture of the time. The wet deck, the cold coming up through her shoes, Harlan on 3 phones simultaneously, Vale speaking in low, rapid sentences to his remaining security staff, Evan sitting on a deck bench with a first aid kit someone had produced and methodically cleaning the scrapes on his hands, with an attention to the task that communicated he needed something concrete to do, and this was what was available. The network had to be dissolved, not locked. Locked could be reopened. Dissolved in the specific technical sense that meant the architecture itself ceased to exist as a coherent operational structure, reduced to fragments that referenced nothing and connected to nothing and could not be reassembled without the person who had built them. Alara was the only person who could do it. She went back below decks. She took the laptop and the secondary device, and she sat in the communications room with water still in her hair and worked with the concentrated speed of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it against a clock that is not abstract. It took 61 minutes. 61 minutes to dismantle 10 years of architecture, the routing structures, the account frameworks, the monitoring systems, the legal entity chains across 6 countries. Each element had to be terminated in the correct sequence, or the termination itself would trigger alerts that would give the Drevna family exactly the data picture they were coming to collect. It was like dismantling a building from the inside while standing in it, You had to know which walls were load-bearing and which came down first, and you had to move fast enough that the structure didn't come down on you before you were done. Halfway through, her hands started shaking. Not badly. A fine tremor, the kind that comes from sustained high-focus work on insufficient sleep over an extended period. She registered it, pressed her hands flat on the table for 5 seconds, and continued. Evan came down at the 40-minute mark with a coffee cup he had found somewhere and set it beside her without a word. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect thanks. He looked at the screen for a moment, at the cascade of termination confirmations moving down it, and then he went back up the stairs. At 61 minutes, she terminated the final structure, a master routing key that had existed in an encrypted partition of a server in Luxembourg since 2014, the original seed from which everything else had grown. She had built it herself, alone, in a rented apartment with no furniture except a desk and a lamp, 29 years old and completely certain she was building something that would protect people. She watched the termination confirmation. It came back green. She sat for a moment looking at it. Then she closed the laptop, picked up the coffee cup, and drank what was left in it, which was cold and tasted like it had been made from whatever was available rather than anything specifically good, and it was the best thing she had tasted in approximately 30 hours. She went upstairs. The Drevna family's Eastern Operations Director was a man named Tobias Kren. He was 54, Austrian by birth, and had spent 30 years building the kind of reputation that existed only in rooms that regular people never entered. He landed at Newark at 10:47 p.m. and was in a car by 11:03 and at the harbor by 11:31, which was when Harlan's people detained him at the pier entrance with the specific, documented, legally airtight authority of a federal task force that had been building a case for 14 months and had just received, via broadcast, the final documentation required to act. Kren did not go quietly, not violently. He was too experienced for violence in a situation that was already lost. But he argued, with the controlled fury of a man who has traveled a significant distance for something that has been removed before his arrival. And his argument was directed primarily at Harlan, who listened to it with the patience of a man who has heard many arguments and knows which ones matter. None of Kren's arguments mattered. The broadcast had established the chain of custody. The organizational documentation was in Federal Archive. The subsidiary chains connecting the Drevna family's operations to the network were authenticated and time-stamped and entirely, irrevocably, out of anyone's hands but Harlan's. Kren was in federal custody by midnight. Harlan called Alara from the pier. She was standing on the yacht's stern deck, which had stopped being wet because the rain had moved off sometime in the past hour, and the harbor was clearing, and there were stars visible in the east over the water if you looked in the right direction. "It's done," Harlan said. She stood in the clearing night and looked at the water and thought about how many times in the past 24 hours someone had said those words and been partially wrong. "Kren," she said. "He had the 3 years of intelligence. What happens to it?" "Seized as evidence," Harlan said. "It goes into the case file. It does not go anywhere else." A pause. "Your name in those files, Alara, the original name. It gets sealed under the protection agreement. No public record, no accessible database. It existed for the case, and it ends with the case." She was quiet for a moment. The water moved against the hull. "The immunity agreement," she said. "Veil." "He testified this evening," Harlan said, "before Kren landed. We did it by secure video from the secondary location. His cooperation is on record. The immunity framework is signed." Another pause. "He gave us everything, Alara. Every structural detail we needed to close the case cleanly. He held nothing back." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. The kind of 3 seconds you take when something you weren't sure would happen has happened, and you need a moment that is only yours before the world continues moving. "Thank you," she said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, something in his professional register had shifted very slightly. "You built something that protected a lot of people for a long time," he said. "I know that's complicated to hear from someone in my position, but it's true." He ended the call. She found Vale at the bow. He was standing with his forearms on the railing, looking out at the harbor, and he had removed his jacket at some point and draped it over the railing beside him, and he was just a man standing in his shirt sleeves looking at water in the clearing night, and the power he carried, the particular gravity of him, the thing that made rooms reorganize themselves when he entered, was still there, but it was quieter, like a frequency turned down rather than off. She stood beside him, not touching, just present in the way that people who have a long history are present, without needing to announce themselves. He didn't look at her when she arrived. He continued looking at the water. "Harlan called," she said. "I know. He called me too." "You testified." "Yes." She looked at the water with him. The harbor was settling after the storm, the surface moving in the long, slow rhythms that followed disruption when the disruption had passed. "Everything?" she said. "Everything," he said. She thought about what that meant. The legitimate businesses, the shipping company, the hospitality brands, the real estate holdings, those survived. Vale had spent 2 years quietly building the clean infrastructure, separating it from what wasn't clean, and what Harlan's immunity framework protected was that legitimate structure going forward. What it did not protect, what Vale had given up in the testimony, was 11 years of operations that had existed in the space between the legal world and the one beneath it. The roots, the arrangements, the network of relationships that constituted the actual substance of what people meant when they said Cassian Vale's name with a particular weight. He had given all of it away, not because he was forced to, because the alternative was Alara becoming a subject rather than a witness, and that alternative had never been acceptable to him, not for 1 minute of the hours since Harlan had explained what the Drevna files could do. She had not asked him to do it. She would not have asked. She knew that, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them said any of this because it didn't require saying. It was simply true, the way certain things are simply true between people who have known each other long enough to be past the performance of truth. "Renko," she said. "What he said. Ask me that question when you understand what he took from me." She looked at Vale's profile. "What did you take from him?" Vale was quiet for a moment. The water moved. 11 years ago, he said, when I brought Victor into the organization, I made him a promise. Not written, not legal. The kind of promise that operates between people who don't use courts. He paused. I promised him a specific outcome, a position in the legitimate structure, not second. First. When I transitioned, he would lead what came after. He looked at the water. Then you came back. 3 years ago, when you needed to disappear. I gave you the protection, the new name, the new framework. And the position I had promised Victor, I restructured, because what I was building legitimate required a different kind of leadership than Victor could provide. You broke your promise, Alara said. I made a different decision, Vale said. I told myself those were different things for longer than I should have. She looked at him, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the 11 years of everything he had decided, and the costs of those decisions sitting quietly in his posture. He didn't just want the organization, she said. He wanted to prove that your word was worthless. Yes, Vale said, simply. She understood it then, the full shape of it, the thing that had lived under the 11 years of patience, the motivation that was not purely financial and not purely ambitious, but was threaded through with something personal, the specific injury of a man who had given his trust and his years and his capability to someone who had, in the end, decided he was not the right person for the future. Renko had been wrong about his methods, and wrong about his choices, and wrong about almost everything operational, But the wound underneath it was real, and Alara looked at Vale and understood that he knew it was real and had known it for some time. "I'm not absolving him," she said. "I know," Vale said. "I'm not asking you to." They were quiet. The harbor moved. Somewhere in the distance, a vessel was making its way toward open water, its running lights amber and white against the dark. "What happens now?" she said. "The company. Harlan's team will be involved in the transition documentation for the next several months," Vale said. "The shipping operation is clean. It's been clean for 2 years. I built it to be clean. The hospitality brands are straightforward. There are legal costs." He paused. "Significant legal costs. But the structure survives." "And you?" He looked at her for the first time since she had come to stand beside him. His pale gray eyes were tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing an enormous amount for an extended period and is only now allowing the management to ease. "I survive," he said. There was something in how he said it that was not simple, not relief, not resignation, but the particular quality of a man acknowledging a fact that has dimensions he is still mapping. She found Evan in the main saloon below deck, sitting on a bench with his back against the hull and his legs stretched out and his eyes open, not sleeping, not on his phone, just sitting. His hands were wrapped in gauze. Someone had done a better job on them than the field kit work he'd done himself. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere unexpected and was taking a moment to understand where that was. She sat across from him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Your father," she said. "He's in contact with Harlan's team," Evan said. "He retained his own attorney this afternoon. He's cooperating fully." He looked at his hands. "The company is finished. The subsidiary structure, the holdings connected to Renko's payments, all of it is frozen. What's left, after the legal process, won't be much." "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. His expression was not the expression of a man who wants to be told it's fine. "Don't be sorry," he said. "He made choices. I made choices." A pause. "I made a lot of choices I thought were mine that weren't." He looked at the gauze on his hands. "I've been thinking about that, about how many of the things I thought I decided were actually just the outcomes of other people's arrangements." He looked up. "The gallery opening where we met. Did you know?" She considered how to answer that. She had thought about this question before tonight, had known it would come, had composed and discarded several versions of the answer. "I knew it wasn't coincidence," she said. "I knew Wallace Mercer had connections to people who knew where I was. I didn't know his specific intention, and She paused. "I was tired of disappearing. I thought I could be careful enough. I thought I had enough distance from everything that it would be manageable." She looked at her own hands. "I was wrong about several things." "You stayed," he said. 3 years. Even when it wasn't what I would have chosen, given full information," she said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "You were not a bad person to be married to, Evan. You were a person who didn't know me and didn't try hard enough to find out. Those are different failures." He absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man receiving an honest assessment and knowing it is accurate and not flinching from it. "The ring," he said, "your ring, when you left it on the counter." "Yes." "That was—" He stopped. "It was the only thing I could give back cleanly," she said. "Everything else was complicated. That was just a ring." He nodded, once, the nod of a man filing something away carefully. "What do you do now?" he said. She looked at the hull, at the curve of it, the solid structural fact of it, something built to go through water and keep going. "I have a name that's mine," she said, "a clean one. Harlan's team has confirmed it's protected." She paused. "I have skills that work in a legitimate context. Financial architecture, network design. There are firms that do this work legally. Some of them are very good. She almost smiled. I have been doing this for a long time without a salary and without recognition and without anything that anyone could find in a public record. I think it might be interesting to do it differently. Evan looked at her. Something in his face had changed over the course of this conversation. Not dramatically, but the way faces change when a long-held frame is gently replaced with a more accurate one. If there's ever a company that needs, he said, and then stopped, because the sentence had several possible endings, and none of them were quite right for this moment, this room, this particular hour. She understood what he meant. Perhaps, she said. She found Vale on the bow again at 2 a.m. She had not been looking for him specifically. She had come up from below because the saloon had started to feel small and she needed air, and he was where she had left him, or near enough, standing at the bow with his jacket back on and his eyes on the harbor. She came to stand beside him. They stood in silence for a while. The harbor was calm. The city lights reflected on the water in long broken lines, orange and white, moving with the surface. I want to show you something, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, small, plain, not ornate, a band of dark metal with a single inset stone that caught the harbor light and held it. She recognized it. She had not seen it in 4 years, but recognition was immediate and physical. The specific sensation of seeing something that belonged to a version of yourself you had thought you were done carrying. He held it in his palm. He was not offering it. He was showing it in the way of someone showing evidence of a thing that has existed in their keeping. I kept it, he said, when you left. I kept it because... He stopped, considered. He was not a man who explained himself often, and doing it now cost something visible. I was not certain you were coming back. I was not certain you were safe. But I kept it as the physical form of an intention. He looked at it. The intention that if you were safe, and if you came back, and if you chose to, I would ask you. She looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about the 4 years, the Geneva clinic, which had been the lowest point, the moment when the body finally submitted the bill for everything she had spent, and the bill was larger than she had expected, and she had paid it in a room with white walls and the specific silence of a place designed to help people become quieter versions of themselves. She had come out of it different in the way that things come out of significant heat different. Same material, different structure. Stronger in some ways, more brittle in others. Entirely unable to pretend that the previous version of her life could be resumed. She had not resumed it. She had built something else. The marriage to Evan, the careful plainness of it, the deliberate reduction of herself to dimensions that felt safe. It had not been a lie, exactly. It had been a choice made from exhaustion. The choice of someone who had decided that invisible was better than exposed and had maintained that decision for 3 years until a man she had made a promise to 15 years ago brought a black and gold yacht into a harbor and said 3 words that ended the invisibility. I don't want to be protected, she said. I've been protected my entire adult life by one arrangement or another. I want... She stopped, started again. I want to be in a situation that is mine, that I chose with full information, with full visibility of what I'm choosing. She looked at him. That's different from what we were before. I know, he said. I'm not the person you married 15 years ago. I know that too, he said. I'm not the person who made that promise. He looked at the ring in his palm. The question isn't whether we are those people. The question is whether who we are now... He paused. Whether that's something. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at the harbor, at the city, at the vessels moving in the dark water, going somewhere or coming back, the ordinary traffic of a world that had continued through the night without pause, indifferent to everything that had happened on this deck. She reached out and picked up the ring from his palm. She did not put it on. She held it in her own hand, looked at it, turned it once in her fingers. "Ask me properly," she said. Something moved through his face. Past the control, past the management, past every layer of composure he had built over 41 years into a life that had required a great deal of composure. Something genuine and unmanaged, brief and not repeated. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing for 4 years and is now in the moment of it. He looked at her. He did not construct a speech. He was not a man who gave speeches. "Stay," he said, "not because you need protection, not because of the network or the organization or any arrangement, just—" He stopped. "Stay because you want to." She looked at him for a long time. The harbor moved, the city breathed. Then she put the ring on. What? 3 months later, the federal case against Viktor Renko was filed in the Southern District of New York. The indictment ran to 67 pages and covered conspiracy, fraud, and attempted extortion across 4 jurisdictions. Renko's attorneys entered a not guilty plea that no one in the relevant legal community expected to survive contact with the evidence Harlan's team had assembled. Wallace Mercer reached a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. His testimony was delivered in a conference room in Lower Manhattan, and he spoke for 4 hours without interruption, with the specific clarity of a man who has decided that honesty is the only remaining currency he possesses and intends to spend it completely. The Mercer family holdings, what remained of them after the frozen assets were accounted for, were surrendered in partial restitution. Wallace retained a modest apartment on the Upper West Side and a diminished reputation, and in the months that followed, began the specific quiet work of a person trying to become someone they could recognize in a mirror. Evan testified too. His testimony was shorter, 40 minutes, and addressed the discovery process, his father's server files, the contact chain that had connected Wallace to Renko's operation. He answered every question with precision and without evasion, and when the prosecutor thanked him for his cooperation, he nodded once and said nothing more. He walked out of the federal building on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the city was doing what cities do in October, bright and cold and completely indifferent. And he stood on the steps for a moment and breathed the air and tried to locate in the configuration of what his life currently was. Something that felt like a direction. His phone rang. "Elara." "Are you done?" she said. "Just finished?" "Good." A pause. "I'm sending you an address. Come when you're ready." He looked at the address when it came through. A building in the meatpacking district, a legitimate financial architecture firm that had quietly opened its doors 6 weeks earlier. Its founding partner listed on the registration documents under a name that was hers and no one else's. He went when he was ready, which was 20 minutes later, and the building was modest and the office was on the 3rd floor, and when he came in, Elara was at a desk by the window with 2 laptops and a coffee that was actually hot this time, and she was working with the concentrated attention of someone who has found the right application for a capability they have possessed for a long time and are only now deploying on their own terms. She looked up when he came in. "Sit," she said. Not Vale's version of the word, a different register entirely, the register of someone offering. He sat. "I have a client," she said, "a shipping company based in Copenhagen that needs its financial routing architecture rebuilt from the ground up. Clean, modern, internationally compliant." She looked at him. "They also need someone who understands real estate as collateral structure, because they're acquiring warehouse facilities across 3 eastern ports, and the documentation is a mess." She looked back at her screen. "I told them I knew someone." He looked at her, at the 2 laptops and the hot coffee and the window behind her that showed the October city going about its business in the cold, clear light. "You told them you knew someone," he said. "I told them I knew someone competent," she said. "I didn't oversell it." He almost laughed. It was the first time in weeks that something in his chest had done that particular thing, risen rather than held. "Copenhagen," he said, "to start." She looked at him. The work goes where it goes. He sat in the chair across from her desk, and outside the window the city moved, and the shipping company in Copenhagen existed with its messy documentation and its warehouse acquisitions. And there was work to do that was straightforward and real and entirely above the surface of anything. When do we start? He said. We already have, she said. Bote. The yacht left Manhattan Harbor on a Saturday morning in November. Vale stood at the helm, not piloting, the crew handled that, just standing in the bridge with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of a man watching a city recede and taking stock of what he is leaving and what he is carrying with him. The legitimate shipping company had its offices now in Hamburg and Singapore. The transition had been painful in the way that significant restructuring is always painful. Loss of revenue, loss of relationships, loss of the specific kind of power that comes from operating in spaces that have no oversight. He had expected the loss. He had not fully expected how much of his identity had been threaded through it, and the process of discovering that had been, in its quiet way, the hardest part of the past 3 months. Alara came to stand beside him. She had a file in one hand that she was working through because she worked through files in most available moments, and in her other hand was coffee that matched his. She looked out at the harbor, at the city in the cold November light, the skyline doing what it always did, asserting itself, certain of its own significance. She looked at her hand on the railing, at the ring. Renko's trial starts in February, she said. Yes, Vale said. We'll be called to testify. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The boat moved through the harbor toward open water, the hull cutting the surface with the steady authority of something built for long distances. He said you took something from him, she said. When I pushed him on the deck, he meant the promise you broke. But I've been thinking... She paused. He said it to me, not to you. He wanted me to know. She looked at Vale. I wanted me to understand that he blamed me, that when you restructured the agreement, it was because of me, my return, the choice you made to protect me over the promise to him. Vale looked at the water. That's accurate, he said. He was punishing me for existing, she said. In part. Vale turned to look at her. He was also punishing me. He found the most efficient way to do both. His eyes were steady. I'm sorry that the weight of my decision fell on you. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the water and moved through her hair. You're not absolved, she said. I know. But I understand the difference, she said, between a person who made a flawed decision and a person who made a malicious one. She looked back at the city, which was smaller now, receding into the November morning. Renko made malicious ones for 11 years. Your mistake was trusting him anyway. Vale said nothing. He looked at the horizon. He accepted what she had said and did not try to expand on it or reframe it, because it was accurate, and she had offered it without obligation, and the correct response to a thing offered without obligation was to receive it without addition. The city continued to recede. The yacht moved toward open water with the particular freedom of a vessel that has cast off all its lines and has nothing holding it to the dock anymore. And the harbor fell behind them, and the horizon opened ahead, and the November sky was cold and clear and enormously wide. And neither of them said anything for a while because the silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had happened and everything that was no longer happening, and the specific quality of a morning on which something very long and very difficult has finally finished. She finished her file, closed it, set it on the console beside her. She put her hand on the railing, not far from his. He moved his hand 2 inches and covered hers. The yacht sailed on, and behind them Manhattan became a collection of shapes against the sky. And then the shapes became a line, and then the line became the horizon itself. And then there was only open water ahead of them, going all the way to wherever they were going, which was somewhere they had not been before.